I'll tell you something. I don't quite know where to look. Not today, at least. Today is the day that the church marks out to celebrate, to remember the ascension of Jesus. The day Jesus, 40 days after his resurrection, rises, ascends up into heaven to be where God is somehow. And I gotta be honest with you, I have a hard time with this day for a lot of reasons, because right off the bat, I'm not quite sure where to look. Other days in our retelling of the story of Jesus' life, we have focal points. We have, a manger at Christmas. Look, that's the manger. That's where the Savior is. Or on Good Friday, we center on the cross. This is where God chooses to lay down God's own life in Jesus at the cross. And on Easter Sunday, we look at the empty tomb as this focal point. Here's the thing to look at. This story is so different. A short version of the story. Luke, who also wrote the gospel that bears his name, we believe wrote the sequel at the beginning of what we call the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles. And the opening scenes have this sort of summary. Jesus appeared to his disciples over a period of 40 days after his resurrection, teaching them, sort of reminding them, here's what you're going to need to do, here's your mission. And then he gathers them up on this hillside, mountaintop, somewhere outside of the city of Jerusalem. And he tells them, stay close to the city, something big's going to happen. And then he says to them, you are going to be my witnesses from here of all that you've seen and heard and the reign of God that has begun in me. And you're going to do that first here in the city, and then out to the immediate area, and out to the outsider territory, and then even to the ends of the earth. It's sort of a charter for how the whole rest of the story, the Cliff's Notes of how the whole rest of the book of Acts goes. And then Jesus starts rising up from them, and it's like he's gathered up into a cloud somehow and keeps ascending further up until they can't see him anymore, until there's all these disciples staring up at the sky, and all of a sudden these angels show up out of nowhere and say, in what, I have to be honest, feels like one of the most tone-deaf questions of the Bible, hey you guys, what are you guys staring at? And then they go on to say, this same Jesus who you just saw rise up into the heavens, he will come back to you the same way that you've seen him depart you. And that's it. That's the end of this scene. The book of Acts moves on to the disciples sort of scratching their heads going, what are we supposed to do now? And that story comes in due time. We'll talk about the story of the coming of the Spirit at Pentecost in due time. But this story, this moment, this episode feels so weird to me because I don't know where to look. The disciples, they start staring off in the sky at an empty space where Jesus isn't visible anymore. And for that matter, nobody really thinks the story is saying Jesus is at some point up in the sky. It's not like in Peter Pan, second star to the right and straight on till morning to get to Neverland. This is one of those stories that it feels like you gotta wrestle a blessing out of to make sense of, especially because the Cliff's Notes version of the story sure seems like it's Jesus got an all-expense-paid trip to go to heaven, and he's leaving us behind. It feels like we're being abandoned, and Jesus just handed all the work that he didn't finish to you and me and said, now you go do it, I'll see you later. And yet, I'm convinced this story by itself is meant to be heard as good news. And that it's good news certainly for the first followers of Jesus who lived through, but it's good news even for you and me today, even if it feels weird to celebrate a story about Jesus, the center point of our faith and our whole Christian religion, about him vanishing from our sight. And I want to suggest that this is the difference. Here's what makes this good news. This story isn't really about a change of geography. The idea of Jesus sort of ascending into heaven isn't about that Jesus needs some way to get to some space where God is. Again, we kind of have this way of assuming that the story is meant to be about geography. And we might imagine, oh, those poor first century people who imagined there's the earth, and then there's sort of a atmosphere above it, and then there's, heavens up there where God lives. Assuming that all those ancient people couldn't understand the story might be about more than a change of geography or about the physical location of where Jesus is. This story isn't about finding the location of heaven at some spot if you go far enough up in the sky. It's about Jesus ascending to power. It's about an authority statement. See, in the ancient world, especially in the cultures where our scriptures come from, not only the story of the scriptures in what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, the Bible that would have been the Jewish books, the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms, there's this recurring image of God as the one who is enthroned with power and who rides the clouds, who rides in the sky. You find this throughout the Psalms, that there's God who sort of shows his divine power by riding the storm clouds and sending lightnings and things, and that God is above all of creation, not distant, but more so that, like, there's nothing outside of God's purview. There's nothing that escapes God's notice, and so that God, who reigns over all the universe, that God has made, God is indeed in charge, that all the other pretenders and powers and empires that come and go, they don't get the last word, but God does. It's this standard image, not only in our Bibles, in the Torah, the Psalms in particular, and sometimes in the prophets, but in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. You'll get images of the various gods of the Canaanite or other Babylonian or other ancient cultures. Their gods are pictured often as sort of riding the chariot of the sun or riding the clouds, and this is meant to be this sort of symbolic image of they have power, they have authority. So when the biblical writers talk about Jesus ascending into heaven in that same imagery, it's almost like this is God's way of saying, let me speak in images that you'll get it. Jesus isn't just alive, he's victorious. And he's not just victorious, he is an actuality Lord of creation. Jesus has begun or inaugurated in a new way God's reign. That's important, because the story of Jesus' resurrection, at first, to be honest, sounds a little shady, right? They show up at an empty tomb and he's not there, he's vanished. I guess the question is Jesus like the villain who gets away to fight another day? Is Jesus sort of slinking off somewhere? Or is this a triumphant resurrection moment? We Christians have learned to read that story, that the tomb is empty not because Jesus slinks away to, plot like a villain to come back in the sequel and do something wicked or bad, but Jesus rises, and that's his victory. That's his way of reigning over the power of death and evil and all the rottenness that is within us and among us and pervades the world. So as Jesus rises up on this cloud, it's again not about geography. It's not if you can squint hard enough you'll find the spot where Jesus went. This is the standard way of saying in the ancient world that your God really is in charge, that your God really does reign. All the evidence to the contrary notwithstanding, that God reigns. And for Christians to say that in Jesus now is the one who has this authority, who is in this rightful place reigning, it's good news about who runs the universe. It means that in the end, the one who reigns and rules over all creation is the one who's willing to lay down his life, the one whose way of ruling isn't about coercion or force, who doesn't have an army or a weapon to his name, but whose way of reigning is servant leadership. His concern is to lift up those who are most cast out and those who are left on the margins. That's what Jesus' kind of reign looks like. And so to see that Jesus is the one who ascends and now sort of is able to do and say the things that only could be said about God in the Hebrew scriptures is sort of a claim about Jesus, that in Jesus we get nothing less than what God's reign looks like now, that if you want to know how God runs the world, how God runs the universe, it looks like Jesus' kind of reigning, Jesus' kind of leadership, you could say. So I want to ask then for you to think about a different image. Use a different kind of faithful imagination. Instead of staring up off into the sky, picture your favorite sports team, and they make it to the championship. Whether it's a one-game event like the Super Bowl or a series of games, those championship games are often held at some other third neutral site, or they rotate away. So you could well win the championship, but not in your home stadium, some far away place, some other city or place far away. Imagine you get to go to the championship game. Maybe it's the NBA championship and it's your team, but it's an away game, or it's a Super Bowl and it's you got to be there and watch your team win, but it's not in familiar, safe home territory. It's at some other stadium. You watch, and then at the end of the game, you're celebrating your team won, but then you watch the team as they exit the stadium, and they're going to be getting on a bus and then getting on a plane and getting out of town because they're going back to the hometown. They're going back to the team, the city where the team resides, and that there's going to be waiting a ticker tape parade in the days we did ticker tape parades, that there's going to be a celebration back there and you're going to be a part of it, that they're going to what is most truly their home and your home as well, and that them leaving the stadium is actually a moment of celebration, of victory, of it's accomplished. And then when you get to that big celebration, when they have the big ticker tape parade, or they get to meet the mayor, they get keys to the city or whatever, that's a moment of there's no tension, there's no anxiety, there's no nail biting. Will my team win or not? It's, oh, they've already won. This is the moment to just bask in the peace that comes from knowing, our team won. They came out on top. It was okay. Something like that is what's happening, I think, in the ascension of Jesus. There's no more of that nervous tension of, what does it mean that the tomb is empty? It's, okay, let it sink in. Jesus is alive, not just by the skin of his teeth, but he's arisen in resurrection, victory, and in power, and that all the other pretenders, the Caesars and the empires and the dictators of all of history, they come and go. Jesus' reign is now this permanent thing. And the imagery of Jesus ascending and riding on the clouds is meant to be a cue to people who that was their way of thinking what we picture as the ticker tape parade when you finally have the victory celebration. This is a way of saying the battle's done, that the contest is over, Jesus' victory is not in dispute. And it's not really a story about Jesus leaving or handing the work to us and saying, now you all do it, but more about Jesus now being in a position to reign in a way that wasn't possible before, somehow yet more fully present for us. I want you to imagine your local representative, your state representative to Congress, or your state representative in your state legislature. And imagine that the one you've got nearby you really like. I realize this may require a great bit of a stretch of imagination if you're not a big fan of your local politicians. But imagine that your local state representative runs for governor and wins. And that's going to mean that they leave their local district, and their local office that's right in your town might close up because they're moving to the capital. They're going to be now, as the leader, as the governor of the entire state. But that's good news, right? Because if you like the character of the person who had served in this one capacity, but now they're going to be governor of the whole state, they're still going to bring that character, that set of values, that way of leading that you respected or looked up to before. But now they're going to be doing it for the whole state, and maybe can impact your life and do good things in even better ways. I realize it's a really, really hard stretch of the imagination sometimes to imagine your politicians actually doing something you're proud of. But if you can at least imagine that, then to say that Jesus' resurrection isn't the end of the story, but that his ascension is a way of saying he's now in a position where he can do good for more people in a more full way. In Jesus' earthly ministry and life, as all the Gospels tell it, he can be in one place at one time, right? He's either in Capernaum or he's in Judea. He's either at Jairus' house or he's with a woman in the crowd. And there are times where that's a real tension. Who's he going to help? There's only so much he can do. And everywhere he goes, there's people clamoring for his help. Meanwhile, lots of folks are waiting in line for Jesus' help, and he can only help one person at a time. He can only save or love or care or bless one person at a time. To say that Jesus has ascended to where God is in some ways a way of saying he's able to be present everywhere now. It's not about one point or another on the map, but the same way that God's reality, God's space is different from ours, and that we don't say that God can only be in one place at one time, but that God has to be in your church at 9 o'clock and then at my church at 10:30, and that's why we have different worship times. It's not like that. God can be present in all places. The Ascension is a way of saying that same Jesus, whose way of leading and living and loving people was about justice and mercy and healing and laying down his life, that Jesus has the ability now to be present in all places for all peoples. It's almost like your local state representative now being elected to governor, and now has the ability to do more good, not just for you where you are, but a whole wider swath of people. And because you believe in that person, in that wider role, that's good news, that they're going to be maybe geographically moved to the capital, but able to help and to serve and to lead you more fully than they could have before, and to do more things at once. The story of the Ascension, then, is, as Walter Brueggemann famously once said, it's the good news of regime change. It's enthronement language, as Jesus is the one who reigns. And if there was any question or doubt about what kind of reign, what kind of kingdom, to borrow that language, Jesus is all about. The same one who went to the cross, the same one who stopped and touched people with leprosy to make them well, the same one who listened and empowered the women who were part of his circle, the one who announced blessing on the poor and fed everybody who was hungry. That Jesus is the one who reigns and gives us the clearest picture of what God's reign is like. So we don't have to look up in some spot and say, well, maybe that's where Jesus is. The whole world is where Jesus is still in operation. And Jesus continues to be about the work of enacting the agenda he set out with at the beginning of his ministry, right? When Jesus first gets up to speak, as Luke tells the story in his home synagogue, it's the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor, to announce recovery of sight to the blind, freedom to the captive, in the year of God's Jubilee favor. That's what he's up to. Jesus is still about that work. So the place for us to turn our attention isn't up somewhere else, not a manger scene or a cross set up somewhere else. It's wherever you find yourself. That's why Jesus basically tells his disciples after he's getting ready to head up the cloud journey up to where God's realm is. He says, you stay put until the Spirit comes on you, and then you're going to be set loose on the world from right here out even to the ends of the earth. The place we're supposed to turn our attention, the place we're supposed to fix our eyes, is the world right around us, to do the same kind of work Jesus has been sending his followers to be about, and to join him in it, because he hasn't vanished. He's now more fully able to be a part of the work you're called to do right where you are, and the work I'm called to do right where I am, all of us at the same time, because Jesus has ascended to be in God's space everywhere all the time. The place to look today isn't up, after all. It's right in front of your face. There's where the work of God's reign of justice and mercy is waiting to be done. Let's get to it.